Hey, space enthusiasts, welcome back to another episode of the Space Business Podcast. It's the first episode of the new year. So, Happy New Year to all of you listeners. Happy New Year to my two guests, of course, as well. And my two guests are Marc Feldman and Hugh Taylor, and they are the authors of a forthcoming book titled Space Piracy: Preparing for a Criminal Crisis in Orbit. And I quote from the introduction of the book: For others, it has long been clear that space has the potential to become a lawless cesspool featuring the worst that humanity has to offer. So, on this uplifting note, we kick off the podcast for 2025. And, gentlemen, if you don't mind, any order, if you could briefly introduce yourselves, and then we shall talk about the book.
Hi, I'm Marc Feldman. I've been involved in space and particularly satellites, but not limited to, since the 1980s, when I was involved in helping the Mexican government and its largest media company put together their satellites for Mexico. I was involved in every aspect of that, from cutting metal to the launch to marketing the subcarriers and everything else in between. I've done investment banking. I have worked in family offices. I've spent a great deal of time in Russia on various business ventures, including oil, but not limited to, and have my own venture capital fund focused on space and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance technologies. And space is baked into that. And we got involved, my partner and I, Hugh Taylor, looking at what is not being really discussed or even examined in even a superficial way, what we believe will be major criminal and piratical activity in space, as well as how it will affect governance in space when we get to asteroids, the lunar and interplanetary activities.
Thank you, Hugh.
Great. And I'm Hugh Taylor. I'm a co-author. My background is mostly in technology and cybersecurity. I've been a writer for a lot of the big tech companies like Microsoft and SAP, and a lot of focus on cybersecurity. So when Marc originally asked me about doing a book about space piracy, I was very interested in it from a cybersecurity angle, because that is kind of the beginnings of what we think is the sort of criminal problem in space is happening in cyber. But that's my background.
Perfect. And so I got to ask the question that's probably on many of our listeners' minds right now. So you guys are obviously, very busy with other things, as you've just laid out, interesting things. How the hell did you come up with the idea of writing a book on space piracy?
The book came into existence because mentors of mine in Washington because of my venture fund in space and ISR technologies, have asked me to sit on the Defense Innovation Unit, which is a horizontal consulting unit to the Secretary of Defense. It's an advisory. You're asked to get on it by having the craziest ideas, and that's what they want. So I was a little reluctant to serve on that because I felt I wasn't ready because of my other activities. So I finally decided I have a really crazy idea that as space commerce and all the activities surrounding it, from cargo ships to mining and various other hard activities on the asteroids and moon, and particularly, and then down the road to Mars, there's going to be a great deal of crime, and particularly pirates. And I was looking at Musk's rockets as Spanish galleons, and there'll be eventually the equivalent of pirates wanting that cargo to disrupt for ransom and other criminal activities. So I was asked to write a paper, because the idea was so crazy, for one of the intelligence journals. And I wound up writing a 65-page article, which was way too long, and I know I needed an editor. So you, besides being my business partner, is also a superb writer, and I asked him to edit it. And he got back to me and said, no, it's not for a journal, it's a book. And so with his talent, we turned that 65-page journal article into a book proposal, and we were fortunate enough to be accepted by John Wiley, the publisher, which offered us a 2-book contract on this and similar themes.
I'll just add to that. What really struck me, and I think Marc and I kind of harmonized on this, was that space was undergoing a transition from, space has historically been sort of a venue for like national honor and heroic acts by patriots and people with sort of pure attention, worldwide peace, making steps for all mankind, this kind of big idea, which is still there, but also as space becomes more commercialized and more commercial entrants are in space, we thought you're going to see the other side of all mankind. You're going to see the potential for crime, and our feeling about space is that just as maritime piracy, takes advantage of transits of valuable cargoes to hijack them and hold them for ransom, space has some similar dynamics. And of course, science fiction has been way ahead of us. There's been space pirates in science fiction for many years, but we were the ones to say this is now about to become a reality. It's not just a movie anymore.
So I gotta ask, when you first pitched this to publishers, did they immediately get that, or what were the reactions there?
Well, I think originally several publishers felt that it was too out there. Like they're like, this isn't really a problem yet. And that's our whole point is, right, it's not a problem yet. This is the time to be thinking about it. And coming from a cybersecurity background, my point was, if you look at this cybersecurity mess that the world is in, it's the result of a lot of well-intentioned but terrible decisions that were made 50, 60 years ago about network security and open architectures. And they said, if you want to avoid that, we should start thinking about mitigating space crime risks now. And so Wiley got that idea, but other publishers were like, no, we only want to talk about stuff that's current policy, current issues. So that's how we landed it there.
Well, we call this book speculative nonfiction, meaning it's not happening now, but it will happen. And I'm 100% convinced it will. And as you just touched upon, science fiction will lead the way. So let me give an example of this. Back in the 20s, there was a movie that he became famous in Hollywood, but Fritz Lang in the 20s directed a science fiction film called Fruit du Monde, The Woman on the Moon.
Yes, Frau im Mond.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, my German native pronunciation is sometimes used.
Yeah, it's your native. It was not mine, but it was a romp. And it was a very interesting romp, and it was a very creative about criminal activity on the moon for thieving and so on. What happened was that in the audience were two very important people to space. One was Wernher von Braun, and the other one was Hans Oberth. Now, they saw the movie at different times, but they got it. And what happened is when the Wehrmacht gave a little seed money, as a venture capital would call it, interesting that it wasn't the Air Force, it was the Wehrmacht, to Wernher von Braun, and they began working on what Braun's vision was with all the other folks involved. The Wehrmacht basically asked that movie be banned, not because of ideological reasons, but because the art direction of the movie was so similar to what von Braun was working on. They felt it was much, much risky to let that movie be in the general public in Germany and in other parts of the world. And, Lang became a very famous guy. We think that is spot on, meaning that science fiction will lead the way. Now, one of the pushbacks that we have gotten, and we have obviously ways of dealing with these legitimate questions, is, yes, space is expensive. How are pirates and criminals going to access it?
Yeah, that was actually on my list. Let's get back to that because I want to talk to all of the, let's call them stakeholders that are involved in the sort of the criminal activity on both sides. Let me take a step back though, because we kind of throwing around here the words, so the title of the book is Piracy. We are very often using a crime here. So I just want to kind of ask you guys a question. Why did you pick that specific title off? Is there any sort of deeper meaning that you called it piracy rather than you could have called it, I don't know, space organized crime or something like that?
Oh, piracy is analogous. There's a lot of very profound analogies between maritime activity and space activities. And the piracy on that is, we believe that these cargo ships and these rocket ships will be hijacked analogously, but in considering the environment of the sea and space is different, like pirates. There will be space pirates. There'll be 21st, 22nd versions of space pirates. It is most likely that asteroids could be the next Jamaica of pirate havens, or Bermuda, or other places. Now, how the pirates And pirates and crime are analogous, just like terrorism and crime are analogous, but terrorism is not identical with crime. Piracy is not identical with crime, although there will be criminal activities and various overlaps of it, because it is our contention that there will be major organized criminal elements in space that will start off as money laundering in space because of the need to diversify their criminal profits into new asset classes. And space is an asset class that is purely ripe for money launderers to access because nobody will think of it. The stakes are expensive, and nobody will think that organized crime will look at it, but it's perfect for them because if they buy expensive space assets, in various ways for investors, or basically buy companies or invest with other space investment firms, or basically take it over, they will have a new source of how to hide money in a quote in legitimate business activities. And that will then lead to their learning curve. And that learning curve, as the cartels in Mexico and Latin America and all over the world, once these learning curves get going, they wind taking it over certain segments of it and then basically become operators of these businesses. Example, in Mexico, much of Mexico's oil and energy business is in the hands of the cartels. They don't operate the engineering or the refining, but they control it through extortion and bribery. We see similar activities of that in space.
So yeah, you bring up an interesting point there, which is sort of, I guess, for the research of the book, because I was trying to think about how you guys did the research to write this book, right? And as you're saying, this is speculative nonfiction. Like we don't have, for all we know, we don't have any criminal activity in space just yet. So it's not like you can research a lot of examples. So I'm supposing your research was probably, as you were mentioning, Mark, looking at quote unquote comparable terrestrial activities and then sort of whatever you want to call it, extrapolating from that. Am I
Right.
getting that right?
I mean,
We interviewed many people, but yes, essentially that was our starting point.
I mean, I think what happened also was we felt that space had a lot of, was very similar to the maritime environment, but we also saw that there were two related issues to explore in the book. One was sort of standard crime, like just, and because a lot of space industry is on the ground, like we think that a lot of what could happen is here on planet Earth with launch facilities and space infrastructure. And then it would also governance and law, because there's a parallel here in that just as the West Indies and the Caribbean were as remote to England and Spain as outer space is now, that there were basically lawless environments. And we think space has the potential also, I mean, it is literally lawless at this point, but it doesn't really matter because not very many entities are there, but and with the potential also for space occupiers to create their own sovereign entities, this is in the future, but like, sovereign states that operate in space, that there's a lot of parallels with piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries.
And so your book has, I was lucky enough to read an advanced draft, so it has an entire chapter on this, on sort of the history of terrestrial piracy. But for our listeners' benefits, is there any sort of, really interesting findings you came across in your historical research that you want to highlight that you think are,
Oh, absolutely. Captain Morgan. Captain Morgan was a pirate and a buccaneer that was, not only did he just ransom and take over Spanish galleons, he went and raised an army of mercenaries into Panama and other areas of Central America, burned down towns, plundered, and went back to Jamaica. It turned out that when he would take over Spanish galleons, first thing he would look for was the documents. Those documents were extraordinarily valuable because many of these documents listed all the secret ports the Spanish had. And he basically was nice enough to go to London and present it to the crown. The crown was extremely appreciative of that. And then essentially you're getting into a tie-in with major espionage activities and criminal pirate activities, and we think it's going to get even more interesting. One other thing is the private aspects of this, like people working on their own in privateering. Now, what is interesting, and I think you'll find this of relevance of your venture capital, the pirates and the privateers, particularly in colonial America, because of their need of having ships that were faster, that could elude all the chasing of legitimate sovereign nations. They were not interested in merchants. They were interested in plunder and to ransom a few hostages. They raised money and they encouraged, and the shipbuilders in colonial America, and the technological advantage that the colonies had was basically to serve the bespoke needs pirates. And America became a shipbuilding nation. So crime, particularly maritime crime, basically triggered technological advancements in shipping, in the way ships were built, speed, etc.
And now we have narcos, I think as people know, using speedboats and even submarines. So,
We can go even farther. There is a company in Australia that is a bespoke contractor for companies that want to enter space on hardware. So if you have an idea, you would go to this company and they would basically, based on AI, provide you with documents and blueprints of how you could realize your vision. They will not build it for you. But this is analogous to basically criminal actors could use companies like this to create bespoke rocket ships and other space vehicles or launch vehicles or communications technology to participate in their own silo in space.
Or they'll
And
just hijack, or they'll steal the vehicles they need. I mean, this is something that you're already seeing. Like, for example, there was a case about 2 or 3 years ago where a container ship run by MSC, a very large shipping company, was boarded in Philadelphia, the United States, by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, and they walked off with $1.8 billion worth of cocaine that was on the ship. And what they found out was that half the crew of the ship were members of a drug gang from the Balkans, and that they had teamed up with Colombian cartels to use this ship to transport drugs. And we think that similar things could happen in space with just, using other people's assets to commit crimes.
let's talk about that in a minute, the sort of
Yeah.
examples of crimes. Just finishing up on the historical parallels here, because I haven't studied this in great detail, and probably many of our listeners have not either. But those, famous pirates, like you mentioned, Captain Morgan. So for our listeners, not only a brand of rum, like actually a famous pirate, like roughly how wealthy were these people? Were they comparable to like the narcos, or how should one think about this?
some were, if depending how diversified they were. Morgan was probably one of the more successful ones. A name that some of your, or many of your listeners would know, with Blackbird, who was a scourge of southern colonial states. He basically did not husband, or many of these pirates did not husband their money well. They basically went to the entertainment sections of the Caribbean and spent it on wine, woman, and song there. And basically, many of them died in poverty. Others did not. And Morgan is an example of the connections with the crown. And he was arrested by the governor of Jamaica because he didn't like the pirates basically strutting around Jamaica. He was sent back in chains to London, but his contacts, because of his intelligence work, he was freed very quickly. So these narco terrorists today, it's not unusual to think that they have other connections that are analogous to what Morgan had, but much more concealed and much more lethal. For example, the Sinaloa cartel basically runs Guinea-Bissau's oil business in West Africa. And you have triads in Asia that are the scourge of basically the South China Sea. And then, of course, China is not immune from this either, because majority of the senior officers in the PLA's rocket force were arrested and maybe liquidated for basically corruption, 11 out of 13 generals in the nuclear forces era. So you can basically stretch your imagination to wonder what the space guys are up to over there and here. And how will they get the talent? Well, the narcotics guys, like the Sinaloa cartels, have recruitment. They have their own recruitment activities. So fentanyl, they see, well, may not get Chinese fentanyl. They're going to make it themselves. So they recruit chemistry students at the universities. It's not that stretch of an imagination that if these guys, when they discover space and they want to get operating in space, they could recruit talent from Lockheed, Boeing, or Roscosmos. And it is true that the Sinaloa cartel is kissing cousins with Russian intelligence and the SVR. So if they want to get really frisky, there's a lot of imaginative activities they could do together with Roscosmos technicians and engineers and executives on the prowl.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting general point you make here, which is basically about the fact that the really large syndicates, what you want to call of organized crime, they are by definition very well organized and powerful and structured organizations, which may have interesting assets, people, connections, knowledge, infrastructure, whatever you want to call it. And so at times may end up being useful even to governments. I guess we don't have to look any further as, Afghanistan being like the center of poppy production and heroin, and once in a while it's an ally for us. So this is really quite, I guess, well established. But so let's move on to actually, we've been kind of talking on a high level about the space piracy, space organized crime, and we've kind of skirted potential examples. But let's actually get into the sort of put some flesh on the bone here, sort of like, what are some examples of space crime you guys are seeing? And you can kind of start with like reasonable near term, maybe should be worried about now, all the way to kind of what sounds crazy maybe today.
So I'll give you an example, something that happened literally this last week that showed the potential. So some people pulled up to the SpaceX launch facility in Texas and said to the guard at the gate, "We're terrorists and we're here to blow up the rocket." And they didn't know if it was a joke or not, but it showed if someone had really wanted to damage the facility, they probably could have gotten in. So one of our basic scenarios is that pirates might, threaten to damage or disrupt space operations on the ground unless they're paid a ransom. We also have a number of scenarios involving hijacking or disabling satellites to stop them from delivering their service, which could be worth a lot of money in terms of ransom. If you went to, say, a television network and said, "We're going to cut off the feed and there won't be any television until you pay us, $50 million. That's an example of piracy, and people could do that from the ground. And there's other scenarios like that, or for example, taking hostages of a space tourism experience and that sort of thing. These are sort of things that are probably possible right now. And then as you go further out, you have more sort of classic piracy of hijacking space cargoes or space, settlements on the moon or asteroids and that kind of thing.
Let me add to what you were saying here. I look at this, and we touched on it in the book. I believe there's going to be three silos in space. You're going to have sovereign nations there. Now, you have the big boys right now, which is the United States, Japan, China, and basically India, and then coming up on the second tier, but moving quickly, is I suspect Israel and Germany. Now, the reason I focus on Germany, which I think is people don't think about it as much, is many of the, if you look at the original space players, they all had one thing in common, and that was basically they understood how to make airplanes. Germany has that expertise. It has the engineering expertise, and basically companies like OHB are basically now drawing all the engineering talent away from the automotive business in Bremen, as you may know better than I do. Now, it's my belief that with the sovereign nations, and that sovereign nations up in space is going to grow from the Arab world, Asians, and so on. That's silo one. Silo two, I believe, on the other extreme will be criminal organizations that will have full-fledged space operations, launch facilities, rockets, in-space servicing, and then basically governance on various planets. Maybe they could be like Jamaica, but they'll be there. In between is what I think is the most interesting. I believe that you're going to have a silo that will play both sides, and that will be the space equivalent of the British East India Company or the Hudson Bay Company, these huge private companies that will have their own private armies that will be beholden to neither criminals or sovereignty, but will work together. And then we will possibly see the utilization of private military organizations providing protection to these large, to be determined huge companies that will be there to engage in commercial and mining and other activities to protect them from the criminals and to keep away the sovereign nations from them, because they will operate on their own. And they will have alliances that will shift very, very fluidly.
So if you start with the sort of most near-term one, let's call them like the ransom type attacks. I mean, from your conversations and research, I mean, that could be going on right now. And I haven't really thought about this, but you're the for example, cybersecurity expert. My gut feel is we probably would, many cases we wouldn't even hear about it, right? Because the victims are not really incentivized to publicize that they gave in to ransom, right?
Right. I think the issue is, I mean, there have been some space hacking incidents. We have not heard of a space like piracy incident yet. And one of the reasons is that it's harder to hack a satellite than it looks. Most satellites have this like dual operating, they have an operating system for the functioning of the satellite and an operating system for the application of the satellite. So it's difficult to impair the satellite completely. But this is changing as more satellites and space vehicles are using off-the-shelf technology like Linux and Intel servers and so forth. They become easier to hack. There's also a principle of hacking that we think helps the space industry, which is articulated by Professor Libicki at the US Naval Academy, which is that any attack that requires two hacking occurrences at the same time is very hard to pull off. So space assets are protected, but as the financial incentives grow, then attackers may become more motivated in terms of their hacking skills. And the issue that comes up with this is something that I think we should have mentioned a minute ago, is that pirates can be deniable actors on behalf of nation states. That we think this is going to happen, and we've had some validation of this idea from the US military and intelligence world, which is you may have a criminal actor doing something disruptive to American space assets, but they're actually acting on behalf of a nation state. The nation state is like, well, we don't have no idea. We don't control these people. It's
Right.
not
So
us.
it couldn't be construed as an act of war, basically.
Right.
Like plausible deniability.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, think of it this way. The plausible deniability of these things is breathtaking. That you could have as, let's say, criminal activity sponsored, but let's go back to SVR and the Russians, with the Sinaloa cartels building their own infrastructure in space quietly. I mean, Mexico is essentially owned by the cartels. So there's many places to do this and many places to quietly acquire the knowledge and wait for the appropriate time. The other thing that should be mentioned is that the entities like the U.S. Space Force and U.S. law enforcement do not think that there can be, because it's not even on their radar, non-state actors in space. Their threats that the Space Force is looking at are sovereign nations, China, Russia, and they track the technological trends. They can't imagine that entities that do not have any direct connections with sovereignty can even be a threat in space. We do. That's what makes us different. If you want to put it in a large concept, is how will sovereign nations deal with non-state actors in space that are criminals and pirates?
Yeah. We'll talk about all of the different actors, including, well, the criminals as well as the governments which may work with or against them in a minute. Just finishing up on the sort of the examples of criminal activity, because I think ransomware, okay, so we talked about that. I think earlier in the episode, one of you already mentioned basically even like potential hijacking of entire vessel.
Yes.
So that would be another one. Any others you would like to highlight that may be not obvious to our...
Hijacking a space station. taking it over like pirates took over ships,
The
particularly the commercial space stations. Well, those are very vulnerable.
the other potential risks are sort of more basic, which is theft of equipment, which is, for example, what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico with oil. Pirates are stealing oil drilling equipment. There's also risks of theft of intellectual property. This is another sort of tangent of piracy, that pirates may steal valuable technology, intellectual property. Those are some of the other. Also, one other thing which we want to mention is, and it's not really piracy directly, but it's related, is the use of space for money laundering. We think that it is a venue for financial crime by buying and selling space assets internationally. Investing in space ventures could be a way for criminal organizations to launder their money.
There's also data hacking, because one of the largest, the focus on the moon is in the South Pole, and you have competing lander companies that are basically accessing data there. That data is potentially extraordinarily valuable to the companies that are engaged in acquiring that data from the landers and the rovers. Well, those can be generally hacked too, but nobody's thinking of protecting those things, at least that we know of. I know a couple of the lander companies, and actually that was a major fear of that data being stolen from them. Excuse me, the rover companies, I'm sorry, that are on the landers. And then there's a whole governance thing. Once you land on the moon, or as Musk wants to do, how is it going to be governed? We believe there's going to be criminal activities inhabiting the moon on these societies as well. There'll be a dual state or a triple state. So if I can give you an example, which is something that we haven't developed fully, but there was a very intriguing book called The Dual State by a gentleman by the name of Ernst Fraenkel. Now, he was a very interesting man. He received his law degree about 3 weeks before Hitler came to power officially, and then signed the Enabling Act, and then basically prohibited Jewish professionals to practice. Well, he spent all this time becoming a lawyer, and he was not going to, and he was real feisty, so he decided to sue the Nazis in court, and he won in a Nazi court. Now, he then discovered other interesting anomalies, and this, now we're talking about the early 30s now, 33, 34, around there. Other interesting anomalies, and it's in his book, about an SA employee that was terminated. And he sued the SA, and the SA argued, well, the Fuhrer's law is law, and there's nothing that we can do about it, so you have nothing to discuss with us, and we're not even going to be recognized and deal with courts. Well, he went to court anyway, and the judges in a Nazi court agreed that the Fuhrer's law is law, but that was basically didn't apply to individuals like him in this particular case, and he won his case. So the idea of a dual state, and we see this in the cartels in Mexico, by the way, and in Latin America, is you have criminals running the place. But on the lower levels, you have, like particularly in Germany, 200, 300, 400 years of legal traditions. Well, those things don't just vanish. So despite the Nazis' efforts to do so, and the cartels' efforts to do so, they still have to basically pay obseisance to legal traditions. And that's what we think is going to happen. Now, what could obviate what I'm just discussing is things in space are so new. You have technological parameters that must be obeyed or you will all die. But you can imagine criminals taking over the life support systems in an environment, whether it be on an asteroid, whether on the moon or in Mars, and say, we'll pull this thing down unless you basically do what we tell you to do.
Yeah. So let's actually segue and talk about the actors involved here. And I guess let's go in no particular order, but Mark, like a few minutes ago, you mentioned the lunar lander companies and them being at some point in time potentially vulnerable, right? And of course, for ransomware, it could be any kind of company, including satellite communications companies and so forth. In your research, it sounds like you have spoken to some of these commercial actors. What is your sense of like how sensitized they are to these potential future issues?
So our impression is that it's people have thought about this, but it's just not very real to them. And I'll give you an example. We were speaking to a space insurance agency, and they insure a lot of space projects, and their reaction was like, wow, we never really thought about this before, because like they say, we insure space in case the thing blows up, or said we don't insure space cargo. Space cargo is food going up and garbage coming down. Nobody's insuring that. So it's like it's a new way of thinking, like, oh, someone might steal this. Oh, okay, that's a new, for them, it's a new line of insurance business. Like, oh, we could charge extra policy for piracy. But part of the issue is and this may sound a little bit abstract, but it depends on how people view the world. How does the world work? And we had a fascinating conversation with Professor Margaret Sankey from the U.S. Air Force University, who wrote a book called Blood Money, which asks this question: how does the world really work? Is it really these so-called Westphalian states, these official nations like the United States and England and Germany interacting, or is the world really made up of these weird alliances between, terrorist organizations and criminal gangs, and who's really making things happen in a lot of parts of the world, which people either don't know is happening or they pretend it's not happening. They go to a country like, you mentioned Afghanistan, like, who's really running Afghanistan? Is it the government of Afghanistan that's represented at the United Nations, or is it some other group of people? That's where this is potentially happening. So so companies, they may not want to talk about it publicly. They may think about it, but what they say is more kind of official.
Okay, and then the second group involved, of course, the criminals. Well, I'm just going to make the assumption that you didn't actually do any first-hand research with the cartels. It strikes me as taking too much risk for writing about.
Right. We talked to several professors who have done research directly with cartels. So we had some pretty clear discussions about what the cartels will and won't do. And I mean, one of the comments we heard was that cartels are typically, they want something they can do right away. This may be a little too futuristic for them. But what they did say, the scale of the cartel financial operations are such that they may be attracted to the size of space opportunities, especially for money laundering.
Money laundering, because of the amounts involved.
Right.
And then lastly, on the sort of actor side, I guess then governments. And have you spoken to government representatives and how they are looking at this?
We've spoken to various people from the U.S. military and intelligence community, and what they said was that, in their view, we were on the right track in terms of what they called irregular threats. We're not the only people talking about this, but the perception is that, at least in the United States, the military and intelligence communities are not well prepared for irregular warfare in space or irregular threats. They're focused on, traditional nation state threats. And that's not a criticism. They simply haven't been ordered to do it, and they haven't been budgeted to do it. So this is why we had an officer from the Space Force who read the book, and he wrote us a little review, and he said everybody at the Space Force should read this book because this is where things are going. So that was a good validation of that idea.
And so in practical terms, so on the government side, because I think at the beginning, when we started recording this episode, it was you, Hugh, you said something that from your experience in the cybersecurity world, that we
Right.
stupid decisions decades ago, or maybe it sounded like we haven't prepared
Right.
enough decades
Right.
ago. So now talking prescriptively,
Right.
in you guys' opinion, like what are some of the things we should be doing at this point?
Well, I think that our last chapter of our book is called "We Need to Talk." Like, this is at a minimum that various stakeholders from different areas of the industry and have to get together and talk. And space brings together stakeholders who haven't probably spoken before to each other to establish principles of what they want to accomplish. And then there's various specific things that probably need to happen. There is in the world of law and international law, there has to be more clarity on what the legal procedures are in space. And then on the technology side, there's some good precedents for like secure engineering principles, For example, the aviation industry has a lot of, it could share on how it designs planes to be safe and secure. It's not everything has to be invented from nothing, but there's also some like bad precedents, like the maritime world, which is probably where a lot of this will come from, is very flawed. You know, the laws of the sea date back, you know, thousands of years, and they kind of have all kinds of problems with, you know, with sovereignty and law enforcement that hopefully we can do better in space. But you have all the difficulties of international law, you know, lack of cooperation, lack of enforcement, you know, voluntary enforcement, all these problems, they're present, and there may not be a magic solution to it. But I think it would be good if there could be some consensus on what should happen, and there might be a need for a new treaty. And what Mark and I have said is it's probably going to happen on two levels. There's probably like the treaty and legal international law framework policy level, and then there's probably the reality of like clandestine, you know, intelligence, like what's really going to happen around this. Like both things will happen at the same time.
Gotcha. So by the way, when will the book be released?
It will be on February 11th, and it will be available to ship on March 1st.
Okay, terrific. So that's about less than a couple of, like, about a month to order it, and then you
right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and so you guys may know we always finish up this episode in the same way, which is talking about science fiction, which funnily enough we already have, because we briefly mentioned the Pheromone movie in Germany as an inspiration of many things, which featured also some, I guess, criminal activity. I didn't remember this part, but it's interesting. And I know there's an entire little section on science fiction in the book.
Right.
And as a hardcore Star Trek fan, I'm also aware of and some listeners of the Orion Syndicate, which occasionally big criminal syndicate in Star Trek. But is there any other sort of favorite crime, organized crime, sci-fi examples that spring to your mind, Hugh?
You know, the truth is there are hundreds of examples, and we have a relationship with an author named James Cambias, who's written many books about pirates in space, and certainly Star Trek has many episodes devoted to it, and in some ways the plot of Star Wars, or the idea, you know, Star Wars has the famous, you know, bar with all the weird criminals in it. Like the idea that space is a criminal environment is very well popularized. So yeah, there's a lot of great examples.
I guess Jabba the Hutt is in some ways a crime lord.
Yes,
there we go.
Sure.
Okay, brilliant notion to finish up on. So again, thank you so much,
yes,
you and Mark as well. Unfortunately, we've lost Mark at the end here, but thank you for coming on and talking about the book. And good luck with the publication. And
thank you.
Looking forward to it.
Great, thank you for having us.